Hello and welcome to the Curated Conversations webinar series, brought to you by the Master of Arts in Museum Studies program, the Master of Arts in Cultural Heritage Management program, and the Johns Hopkins University Office of Advanced Academic Programs. Today's event features a discussion with Victoria Reed on the art of provenance research. My name is Peter Huggins, and I'm the event producer. Please note, today's event will be recorded and uploaded to the AAP YouTube channel under the Curated Conversations playlist. During the program, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function, and we'll answer as many questions as possible during the latter portion of the event. With that, I will turn over the presentation to our moderator, Dr. Sarah Chacon, Program Director and Senior Lecturer for the Master of Arts in Museum Studies program.
Thank you, Peter. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Sarah Chacon, and I'm the Program Director for the Museum Studies and Heritage Graduate Programs at Johns Hopkins University. Now, classes for us kicked off this week, and what better way to begin the academic year than with our first Curated Conversations, the speaker series for the Museum Studies and Heritage Programs. So we are delighted to be able to begin our year with you and with two very special guests that are joining me tonight. So we are joined by guest panelist, Dr. Victoria Reed, who has been conducting provenance research in art museums for over 20 years. Many of us are familiar with her work at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. As the Senior Curator for Provenance, she oversees provenance research and documentation, responds to ownership claims, and coordinates and implements due diligence policies and practices for the curatorial division. Victoria's scholarly interests include the collecting of histories of stolen artwork, particularly those looted art that came to America after World War II, the development of museum ethics in the United States, and the iconography of decapitation in medieval and early modern Europe. Now, sadly, we will not have time tonight to discuss the iconography of decapitation, but we do hope that the opportunity arises in the future. Now, the other panelist joining us tonight is no other than our very own Dr. Stephanie Brown. Stephanie is the Assistant Program Director for the Johns Hopkins University's MA in Museum Studies. She coordinates internships for both the Museum Studies and Cultural Heritage programs, regularly teaches our course in curatorship, and frequently is the lead instructor for our on-site seminar class, where she will be joining students this November in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. In her other life, Stephanie is a trained academic historian and a former museum curator. She discovered Flowers and Fruit, a still life formerly attributed to Paul Gauguin, in a museum in California's Central Valley in 2016. Intrigued, Stephanie began to research the painting's history and ask questions about its provenance. What started as a little digging around on the internet became a blog and then turned into a book. The Case of the Disappearing Gauguin, a study of authenticity in the art market, came out this summer. Now, this evening, we're going to listen in as Tori and Stephanie talk about the disappearing Gauguin, the art market, and provenance research. We will have time for questions and comments from the audience at the end, so be sure to hold your questions. And so now, without further ado, Stephanie, could you please start us off by talking a bit more about your new book?
Yes. Thank you, Sarah and Peter and Tori. I'm so glad you joined us. And I'm watching everybody say hello in the chat, and I'm seeing so many of our current students and former students and friends, and it's just fantastic. Peter, can we put up my slides? There we go. So in the winter of 2016, I signed on to do a curatorial project with the Haggin Museum in Stockton, California. The Haggin is a regional art and history museum about 80 miles east of San Francisco, 50 miles south of Sacramento. It has a collection of local and regional history, as well as a collection of late 19th and early 20th century American and European art. And I included this, sorry, Peter, sorry, go back, there we go. I included the map image so that you can get a sense of exactly how Stockton fits into the rest of Northern California, and I think that's an important part of the story. Now let's go ahead, Peter. Sorry. On my first visit to the museum, I saw the still life called Flowers and Fruit that was attributed to the post-impressionist Paul Gauguin, and it was inscribed "À la miroir, PG," to the friend Roy, PG, for Paul Gauguin. I was really surprised to see a Gauguin in Stockton because there, first of all, aren't as many Gauguins at large in the world as there are, say, Monets or Picassos. Monet and Picasso both lived to be old men. They both saw success in their lifetime. They both had large, complicated, close families and long-term profitable relationships with art dealers. So their long lives gave them time to produce large bodies of work. Their lifetime success meant that there was financial incentive to keep track of all those paintings. And their close connections meant that there were people around to superintend their legacies. So none of that was true for Paul Gauguin. He died when he was 55. His paintings, drawings, prints, writings, ceramics saw no financial success during his lifetime. He spent his last decade estranged from his biological family and living in the South Seas, literally on the other side of the planet from everyone he knew in the French art world. So finding a Gauguin in Stockton was surprising, partly because there just aren't that many Gauguins around. In California, there's just a handful in museum collections, and those are all in museums that you've heard of, like the Getty and LACMA, okay? A year later, I finished my project with the Haggin, and I came back to the Gauguin because I wanted to know its story, how it came to be there, why. And what I learned was that in the decade that museums began to collect modern art, flowers and fruit traveled the art market in Paris and New York. Experts and connoisseurs hailed it as a signature work of Gauguin, just as he became to be acknowledged as a master. When it joined the Haggin Museum in Stockton, locals treasured it as the museum's Gauguin. But by 1964, Gauguin scholars and experts in Paris and New York had lost track of the painting and declared it lost. When it resurfaced in 2018, they questioned its authenticity. How could a genuine Gauguin have been hiding in plain sight in a provincial American museum? So the question is flowers and fruit a forgery, or is it an authentic Gauguin? That's the question that I built my book around. But the idea that came to be central was that this still life contains histories not only of specific lives, but of networks of trade and of symbols of wealth and privilege. And whether or not it's an authentic Gauguin, it is an authentic object that has traveled across time and space. And so questions around its authenticity are part of that story. They're not simply about authorship, but they're also, I think, about status and access.
Stephanie, thank you. And thank you for inviting me tonight. And thank you for inviting me to read your book. I really enjoyed it. I do provenance research full time. And just for people who aren't familiar with that term, provenance is the history of ownership of a work of art. But I often describe it as like the biography of a work of art. And that's really what this book is the biography of a painting. So people have read like The Hair with the Amber Eyes or The Missing Pages. It's really sort of chapter by chapter what this painting's life looked like. And so there's a lot of things that I really liked about this book. I mean, one thing I frequently say is that you really can't extricate a work of art from its provenance, right? Questions of taste, questions of market practices, condition, conservation, authenticity, they're all inextricable from an object's basically life history. But this was also a mystery, right? I wanted to know, like, is it an authentic Gauguin? Is it not an authentic Gauguin? And so that also kept me sort of flipping the pages. But it's also a really rich look, I think, at the art world and the art market and the museum world. When you go online, if you go to the Museum of Fine Arts website and you look up the provenance of a work of art, you see data, right? You see sold by Mr. Smith to Mr. Jones, and then it was auctioned, and it's a fairly cut and dried story. But to get to that data is a much deeper and much messier process. It's never as simple as putting together the receipts that everybody has saved, if only it were that easy. It's about the circumstances of the lives of the people who owned the work of art. It's about the historical connections, whether it's familial connections, business connections, the historical circumstances that people lived in. And I think that's really what your book touches on. So all of these stories that exist around this painting of flowers and fruit. So my first question's for you, sort of a twofold question. Can you explain like how the painting surfaced? Sorry, can you explain how the painting resurfaced in 2018? And then can you explain how the painting sort of surfaced for the first time? Like, where does its life history begin in this book?
Right, that's right. Thank you. So in 2018, I saw the painting. I thought, well, this seems strange. And I discovered that the museum had done some research 30 years ago trying to figure out what was going on. And then they had set the research to one side because they had a gazillion other things they had to do. I knew that the Wildenstein-Plattner Institute, which is the research institute that now manages the catalogue raisonné for Gauguin and many other important artists, was working on an updated catalog. And so I put together a chunk of research, a long paper, and I sent it off to them saying, hey, look, here it is. It hasn't disappeared at all. It's been here in Stockton the whole time. And they summoned the painting to New York. We heard on Tuesday that, could the painting come to New York next Wednesday? And we scrabbled together to find the truck that was going east. And they looked at it, they said, well, yeah, I don't think so. Well, it's a nice painting, but I don't know. So it's not in the new catalog. Does that mean it's not a Gauguin? Well, I mean, obviously I think it's gray. I think it's gray. And so because I thought it was gray then, I think it's gray now. I went back as far as I could to the beginning, and that gets us to the first time that the painting came on the market. So it came on the market in 1923 in Paris in April. When I started the research, I knew that I needed to start with the provenance, as Tori just talked about, the provenance that's published in a catalogue raisonné. A catalogue raisonné is a list of all the known works of an artist, and it includes a provenance. Sometimes it includes an exhibition, sometimes it includes inscriptions, sometimes there are critical essays. Started with the 1964 catalogue raisonné for Gauguin that Wildenstein had published. And let's look at that entry. So here's the 1964 catalog. The entry for flowers and fruit looks like this. Here we see flowers and fruit in the left, it's my left-hand column. It might also be your left-hand column. And then down below, it's listed as provenance. There we go. So you see it starts with the painter Roy, and then Barbesange between 1920 and 1922, and then a sale on April 14th, 1923. It was number 73 in the sale, and it sold for 14,000 francs to Sacha Guitry. 6 years later, on 27th April, it was number 99 in a sale, and it went to a man named Kaganovich. Then it went to the Reinhardt Galleries in New York before 1957. And then the big word, disparu, which means it was lost, disappeared. It is also fun to think about that in French, disparu can also mean that something has died, that somebody has died. So we won't go into that part of my thinking today because we don't have time, but isn't that fun? So of course I start to try to reconstruct this provenance. And Wildenstein thinks that the painter Louis Roy owned it first. Well, if you've ever, Googling Louis Roy is a little bit like Googling Stephanie Brown, except actually it's worse because brown just means brown, but Roy in French means king. And there were 16 kings named Louis. So if you get a lot of people who are not this artist, Louis Hua, when you Google him. So here he is, his portrait by Paul Gauguin, probably painted in spring 1890. Here's a photograph that is previously unpublished of him with his son Jean, probably about 1900. He does, I mean, look at those fabulous mustaches, right? Really impressive mustaches. And look at his sweet little boy in his sailor outfit with his watch chain. Louis Hua died in 1907. There are no known family papers, and I've looked in a lot of places. There are no known family papers. Let's go to the next slide. At the Musée d'Orsay, I checked the remaining archives for the Galerie Barbazange. Remember, they're the second people in the Provenance, right? The Galerie Barbazange marketed modern painters, including works by Gauguin in the 1910s through the mid-1920s. Their ledgers have gone to the archives in the Musée d'Orsay. There's no mention of this painting. One of the photos obviously is the work desk in the Musée d'Orsay. The other is, and I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of you have pictures kind of like this. This is the photograph from the staff elevator going up at the Musée d'Orsay. So that, because you know, I am who I am, and that was a really exciting moment for me to get to be in the staff elevator. So there's no flowers and fruit in the papers for the Galerie Barbazange. That's the second listing in the Provenance. Let's go to the next slide. So across the river in the French National Institute for Art History, I did find the sale catalog from 1923, from April 14th, 1923. Found the sale catalog for when the painting first sold, right? And here it is, it's number 73. It's a still life, roses arranged in 2 vases, at the foot of which are placed some apples, signed in the lower right with the initials PG and dedicated to the Francois. And then it gives its size. Size is really important because flowers and fruit is a really common subject to paint. Artists paint the same subjects in different times and different places, but if you know the size of the canvas, that's something that doesn't change, right? It might be called flowers and fruit one time, it might be called roses in a, I don't know, it could be called anything, but the canvas is always going to be the size that the canvas is. So I knew that I was on, I had found a trail, right? So let's go to the next slide, Peter. So I went to the Paris City Archives on the other side of town. It's the, all of the Paris auctioneers, all French auctioneers are required by law to deposit their records in the city archives. And so I was able to find the auctioneer's records for this sale. And here, this is just explaining that here we're bringing all these things to auction. And these are the people whose stuff we are putting on auction. And number 19 here is Monsieur L. Marseille from Paris. And then here's his address, 16 Rue de Seine. And I realize that as I'm telling you this, I'm showing you where it is with my mouse, but just imagine that you can see my mouse. So I knew that somebody named Marseille, I could look up somebody named Marseille in the Rue de Seine in Paris in 1923. So I did that, and I found out that Léon Marseille had a gallery that sold modern painting. If he has a gallery that sells modern painting, then why isn't he selling this painting in his gallery? What's that about? I don't know. The family was closely involved with the Paris art scene. Léon's father-in-law was the artist Paul Signac, the guy with the dots, if anybody if anybody can scroll back to their art history classes or their last museum visit. We're talking about the guy with all the pretty little dots. His stepdaughter married Léon Marseille. I found auction records, pointillism. Yes, Yasmin from upstate New York, I think. Pointillism, thank you. I found auction records, newspaper articles, advertisements that revealed that the Marseille Gallery had bought and sold works by Gauguin before, in addition to works by other artists who were prominent at the time. His gallery remained open until the early 1970s when he retired. So I knew that he was legitimate. He wasn't somebody who was, forging paintings in his attic. But I didn't know then, and I don't know now, how he came to have this painting to consign to auction, or why he consigned it to auction instead of selling it in his gallery.
Yeah. Of course, as a Provenance researcher, I was like, well, how did he get it? Like,
Yeah,
why does the trail end there? But that is so much of what this work involves, is like not necessarily answering all the questions that you set out to answer, and coming up against dead ends, and looking in 17 different places for things. It's not all online. You do have to go to the archives, and even with archival material, you still may have unanswered questions. But that's really interesting. And it's interesting to me too, that the painting sort of emerges, it like surfaces really for the first time documented in the 1920s, right? So we really don't know where it was before 1923. And you talk a lot, and this is another thing I really like about the book, is that you talk about the artist's place in the history of art. Really, you can't look at this one painting in a vacuum. We have to look at, the market for Gauguin and Gauguin's legacy, and who was collecting him, and who was supporting him, and who was selling him, and what the demand was. Like, what is the demand, and when does that demand increase? When does it decrease? So can you tell us a little bit about like what kind of demand there was for Gauguin at this time? Like, had he always been popular? Was he rising in popularity? What was going on in the 20s in Gauguin?
Right. Yes, that's great. The 20s were in the late teens is when Gauguin finally kind of broke through. Of course, his work broke through. Art dealers had been showing his work for years, and there was a consortium of art gallerists around Europe who were packing up crates of modern art and sending them from city to city to city to city. And in every city, somebody, some critic would lose their mind because the public was being hoodwinked, and yada yada yada. So people weren't really only like the high end, only really specific collectors were collecting his stuff. But then in 1917, Edgar Degas, the Impressionist, the painter of, the little dancer, right? Everybody got Degas. Degas died. He had collected Gauguin. And so there's a series of sales of his studio, his private collection, and the public realizes, the art world public realizes that Degas has been in on Gauguin from the start, and it gives Gauguin a lot more cachet. And so his works start to sell for a lot more money. The Tate Gallery in London accessioned to painting in 1919. One art critic that year or the year after labeled Gauguin as one of the most necessary, all caps, French artists of the 19th century. He starts to be collected in the US, at Brooklyn, at the Met, at the Art Institute of Chicago. They all start to build Gauguin collections in the 1920s. And important collectors like John Taylor Spalding started hunting for Gauguins, and that's where the Museum of Fine Arts pops in.
Yeah. So Spalding was very generous, one of our very generous and most important collectors at the MFA. He collected Japanese art, but he also collected Impressionist and Post-Impressionist painting. And he gave us a major gift in 1948 of 90 paintings and pastels. And so it included Impressionism, but it also included post-impressionism. It included 3 Gauguins, as you have here. And it was interesting because Boston had been a center of collecting impressionism, but it's not a city, and certainly it's not a museum that's known for its very avant-garde tastes. But I went down a little bit of a rabbit hole today, and I don't want to hijack your talk, but it is interesting sort of looking at how we came to own our Gauguins. These were not our first post-impressionist paintings to enter the collection. The first major post-impressionist painting that we acquired was in 1935, and that was Van Gogh's portrait of the postman Rouen.
Oh, yeah.
And that was a gift. And then in 1936, we purchased a major Gauguin. Where do we come from? Or as we refer to it at the MFA, du venant nu, because Gauguin inscribed its much lengthier title on the painting itself. It's like a 12-foot long canvas, and it is absolutely one of Gauguin's masterworks. And so the Van Gogh and the Gauguin, like today, they're icons of the MFA, right? Like we've got them on postcards, and we've got them on whatever, not t-shirts, but we've got it on merch at the shop. But at the time, in the 1930s, this was considered like very new. It was considered strange. And I took a look at the press accounts from 1936, from when we bought this Gauguin, and I was really struck. We have a whole bunch of them accumulated because it was a major purchase. Gauguin is referred to as strange in like every other press account. The painting is called strange. And the allure to people, me reading between the lines, seemed to be they saw Gauguin as this kind of like tortured soul. There are many references in these articles about the acquisition of a painting to his suicide attempt, to his poverty, to his living in the South Seas. So there was a kind of, I hate to use the word exoticism, but I think people had a very sort of romanticized view of this like tragic artistic figure. But it's also interesting to read some of these reviews. I'm just going to quote from 2 choice reviews. Gauguin has a developed taste. People are apt to dislike him violently the first time. At his worst, he was about as wretched as Van Gogh. Ralph Adams Cram probably had both of these strange creatures in mind, again, this word strange, when he said that, quote, perfectly terrible things have been achieved in the name of art, unquote. So this was people's reaction to Gauguin in 1936 in Boston. We paid an astronomical price for Du Venant Nu. It was $80,000 in 1936. We bought it from Marie Harriman Gallery in New York. I looked to see like what does that mean? What does $80,000 mean in 1936? In 1935, we had bought a Manet, The Monk in Prayer, for $51,000. Wow. In 1937, Renoir's Dance at Bougival. This is another one of our icons. It's a large Renoir painting of man and a woman dancing, very, very popular, very palatable by a known artist. That was $150,000. In 1941, we bought a very large Rubens painting of Tomyris and Cyrus for over $53,000. So $80,000 was a lot. And so that leads me to my next question for you, and I'll stop talking. But how does that compare to the prices that were paid for this still life? How does this compare to the prices in the 1920s? I know you had a slide up before that showed in 1923, it sold for 14,000 francs, I think. And then just a few years later, it was 42,700 francs. So how does that happen in a short span of time? How does the price increase? And like, what kind of prices were these?
Right. And that's something that it was, you know, if you know me, then you know that it was harder for me to do those kinds of mathematic conversions than it was for me to find the documents in the archives. In 1923, Flowers and Fruit brought the second highest price at the sale. And the highest price was a painting by Courbet that sold for 55,000 francs. And now you can go look at it at the Detroit Institute of Art. And it's a big, more or less tasteful nude of a woman sleeping by a stream. I mean, it is what you're imagining. But Courbet was like market gold. Courbet was somebody that Americans would come and buy because everybody knew that Courbet cost a lot, and they wanted everybody to know that they had a lot of status because they had this painting on the wall. 14,000 francs for the Gauguin was surprising for people then. In the auction, the daily auction newspaper, there was talk about this was a complete surprise that the Gauguins brought these high prices. It was, to put it in our terms, it was about $930 in 1920, and $930 in 1920 would be about $15,000 today. So, I mean, it's not nothing, right? I mean, most of us are not going to go out and buy a $15,000 painting in an afternoon. When the painting came back on the market in 1929, it was early 1929. It was a boom economy. Prices had gone up generally. Gauguin had entered the market, had become, at least for a certain echelon of collectors, a little bit less strange, or maybe that he was strange was attractive. The person who had bought the painting in 1923, let's go next, Peter, was the French celebrity Sacha Guitry. He was an actor, writer, producer, director, and he was the man voted most likely to be photographed standing in front of his collection wearing a velvet suit. There's a whole series of Sacha wearing different versions of velvet suits and looking very much like he looks in this photograph. So imagine he was a big deal in France in the 1920s and 30s. He didn't have a great World War II, so that got a little more complicated later, but we don't care about that. We're not talking about that today. Sacha had bought this painting and he hung it in his studio salon, next to his Monet and next to his Vuillard. So he had a really important collection. He knew these guys. He collected their work. He was a man about town. And so him selling bits of his collection off in 29, the fact that the collection came from him made it more valuable. And the celebrity association, I think, is a really important part of the provenance to think about.
Yeah, and I think there's this idea of a work of art having a kind of prestigious provenance, right? Or if it belonged to someone that had good taste or a good eye, you can be the next person in that chain of ownership. You are implicitly comparing yourself to that person. So I think that's part of perhaps the draw there, and could certainly increase the price. But market price, I think, is another thing that provenance researchers actually have to keep in mind. You don't necessarily think that that's part of the work, but people tend to document what they value, whether they value it for sentimental or emotional reasons, or whether they value it monetarily. And usually it's the latter. So the presence or absence of documentation, I think, can depend a lot on how much value was assigned to a work of art at any period in time. So, for example, we sometimes come across works of art today. There's not a lot of documentation for them. There may be no paper trail whatsoever, and it's not because something shady happened or someone, destroyed the documents. It's simply that certain artists have not historically been popular. They haven't been marketable. They haven't been documented for that reason, and so they're harder to trace. But I would also say, in general, there's probably less incentive to steal or falsify an artist that has a lower market price, right? It's just not going to be worth it. Though, we as art historians generally know that not all artists who are popular today that command high market prices have always been popular or valuable. It's just something interesting, sort of as an aside, that I've seen this get lost sometimes, particularly when provenance research is not so much an art historical realm. When we get into areas of litigation or restitution claims, I think I've seen assumptions being made that sometimes that an artist's work, well, it must always have been in demand. Therefore, there was always of course, Klimt was always valuable. Of course, Sheila was always valuable. And it's simply not the case. So I think there's probably less of an incentive to steal artwork or to hide or falsify information if there's not that market value. So that is a long way of bringing me to my next question for you, which is, in your opinion, do you think in the 1920s, in 1923, there was sufficient incentive to falsify Gauguin?
Right. And that's something that, I've thought about a lot. Was there financial incentive to pass off a fake Gauguin in 1923? I'd say, maybe. His work was gaining in value. People were starting to be interested in collecting his work. But the issue is, and let's go to the next slide, that Gauguin was known then, as he is now, as a painter of Tahiti and Brittany. And, if you think about Gauguin, then if you think about Gauguin at all, which I realize many of you don't, but you're probably going to picture paintings that look like this, that have these strong colors and these strong but very mysterious narratives, that it is exotic. It is, the Tahitians are exotic for all the reasons that they are, and that's a whole other book. But the women in their starched Breton caps, in the Vision After the Sermon, they were also exotic for people in Paris, right? That was like thinking about like if you're a historical interpreter and you dress up, right, and you're making the apple butter, right? I mean, that's the kind of remove that these women in their starched white caps and their dark clothes coming home after the sermon on a Sunday, on a special day, on a feast day, that's the kind of degree of difference that there would be between the avant-garde Paris art world and rural Brittany. All of which is to say that Flowers and Fruit is just a totally ordinary still life, right? There is nothing controversial about this painting at all. So if I were going to fake a painting and make some money off of it, then I would want to fake a painting that played to the stereotype of the artist, right? It seems counterintuitive to paint a perfectly ordinary run-of-the-mill still life when the thing that your artist is famous for is these wacky and surprising and unsettling images.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. So I would like to shift gears, if that's okay, because one of the parts of your book that I found most interesting did not have directly to do with the painting. It had to do with the museum that now houses the painting, right? The Haggin Museum. And you talk about its origins, this kind of fledgling museum in California that I found very interesting. I will be honest, I had not heard of the Haggin Museum before I read your book. It is obviously very different from where I work, which is the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And one thing that I was struck by was the role of women in building the foundational collection of this museum and even leading the museum at a pretty early date, particularly because here we are, it's 2024, and I would say that female directors at art museums are still the exception rather than the rule. And I don't know if that is an East Coast sort of bias, but I would love it if you could tell us a little bit more about the Haggin Museum and its early years.
Yeah, that's great. It's a really fascinating story. So Stockton was a gold rush town. Stockton is sort of the last stop before you go out into gold country. It was where you stopped to get your flour and your gold tools. Sorry, I don't have better words than that. 2 generations pass, and the grandchildren want to have a museum to honor their forebears. And, there's some really, really terrible poetry that I quote in the book about the pioneers coming over the mountains. So they want to have a museum of local and regional history, and they can't pull the money together. So this woman whose grandparents and father made scads and scads of money in the gold rush and afterwards, is now married to a son of Stockton. And she has just inherited her family's collection of really large paintings, paintings that are measured in feet, Bierstadts and other Hudson River, very large paintings. Notice 36 1/8 by 52 1/4, that's inches. So it's 3 feet by over 4 feet. I mean, this is like, you've got to have a really big house, right? You've got to live in a mansion. She did not want these paintings. And so she said, well, I will donate these paintings. I will give you the money to build the building, but you've got to take my family's art collection with it. And so that really set up the central tension that the museum has always struggled with between how do we marry this collection of spinning wheels and tractors and pickaxes, and there's some human hair wreaths, which, dear to my heart. Human hair, these sorts of, really fabulous material culture collections from the pioneer era, with this collection of American and European 19th, early 20th century academic art. And you see this all the way through the museum's existence. There's like, oh, we're going to do this. Oh, yeah. And then there's this. The museum's second director was a woman whose name was Frances Garden Noble. Now, she had to have been one of the very first women to direct a museum in America. I don't know if Marjorie Schwartzer is here. She will know the answer to that question. But she is one of the first very, very few. At the same time, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, it's now called that, their first director was a woman. And I think that what happened was, on the West Coast, in California in the 1930s, it's still kind of a raw, new place. And a lot of what people in California want to do, and these are gross generalizations, but they want to do things not like they did back east. They want to take more risks. They want to, or take different kinds of risks. They want to create their own identities. And I think that's one thing. I think also what happened is that they also are not that interested in art. They're just not that interested in art. These are guys who, these are bootstrap people. And they're not interested in the polish and in trying to pass themselves off as European aristocrats, just transplanted. And so there's a little bit of space for a woman to have that job because it's not as prestigious, I don't know. I think that's something that would be really fascinating to work on more. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, when I read that, my jaw kind of dropped to the floor because we've not had a female director in Boston. But I do think the role of women in museums is certainly one that's very near and dear to my heart, and also the role of women in establishing provenance research as a field,
Yeah.
and the
Yeah.
role of women in art restitution. But that's a topic for another time. So the painting is at the Haggin Museum, and then how does it disappear? Like, what does that
Right.
mean? How does it disappear?
Right. Right. Peter, let's skip the next. There we go. Thank you. So the painting arrives in Stockton in 1939. The heiress, the benefactress, had died in 1936. Her husband stayed in New York for another few years, and then he cleaned everything out to move to Florida. And he packed things up and sent them to Stockton, sent them to the Haggin Museum. The museum was beside itself. The local paper published a column talking about the museum's Gauguin and saying, oh, I hope someday the museum has the resources to do some research and find out more about this painting. They unpacked it, they hung it on the wall, and it pretty much stayed there for the next 80 years. The museum has never been able to afford to hire an art curator. The history collection's been studied and used and visited and added to, but the art collection has mostly hung on the walls. And the community's interest, what the museum was about for the community was their history. It was not about this art that came from somewhere else and was sort of about other people, you know? But the way that we know about works of art is when they are shown in exhibitions, when they travel, when people write about them. Flowers and Fruit never did any of those things. And no one ever wrote about it. So in 1964, when the Wildenstein Catalogue Raisonné came out, the painting had, so far as the Paris and New York art world knew, it had disappeared, right? And so we're going to finish up with a very quick and easy poll, just to prove my point. Okay, can you see your poll? The first question is, how many of you had heard of Stockton, California before today? You have to be game and do the poll. Oh, I can't vote, but you can, so vote. The second question is, how many of you have ever visited Stockton, California? Okay. And Peter, when you have the results, can you give them to us? And that is how a painting disappears.
Yeah, it's incredible.
Isn't that great?
Really incredible.
Yeah. How about that? All right. I think we've talked a lot, but we have some time for questions.
And we do have quite a few popping into the chat, actually into the Q&A thread. So if you have some questions for our panelists, do pop them into the Q&A thread and we will try to get to them. So I'm going to go way back to the beginning of your talk and that wonderful photo of the staff elevator, Stephanie. And one of our attendees is asking if those records, auction records in the city of Paris, those kinds of materials that you were able to dig into, are they accessible to anyone who goes there and requests them? Or do you have access to them because of your academic interest?
It is a combination of things, but you do have to have credentials. And you have to have the language. And those are steep steps. But that's true in France. that's where I've done this work. In the US, working on American art, I don't know how that works. I have
American archives tend to be a little bit more
less
accessible. Like anyone can just go to the National Archives or go to the Archives of American Art, for example.
Yeah.
Go to the Getty. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a text from Marjorie Schwartzer, who wrote a book about who wrote the book about the history of museums in America, and she says that in the West there's a long tradition of female museum directors and smaller museums having women directors. But that, of course, is not the case back east. Anyway, all right, how about next?
All right. There were some questions about that wonderful looking gentleman in the velvet suit. And one of our attendees asked whether he was considered odd or eclectic or different like Gauguin, and if that would have increased the value of the piece.
Oh, that's a great question. He was a celebrity. I mean, he was like super cool. He was having dinner with the president and hanging out with Monet and taking up collections to put up statues of famous people. I mean, he was, yeah.
Thank you. So we've got another one that Stephanie, you wrote that, and I'm afraid I'm not a French speaker.
It's okay.
So I apologize for the pronunciation. I know it's not Louis Roy.
That's okay. But Louis Roy, there is no shame in saying Louis Roy. That is a reasonable thing to say.
Thank you. So you wrote that he trained and worked with Gauguin, even finishing his woodcuts at his request. So in addition to creating his own artwork. So given that he held a good number of artworks in his personal collection, is there any evidence that he faked the art or forged or falsified provenance or lied about or misassigned artists or any other artworks in his collection or otherwise?
That is a great question. And there are people who think that. I am not one of them. He was not a very good artist. He was not a very good artist. In his oil paintings, often the shadows go in the wrong directions. So like one object will cast a shadow that way and another object will cast a shadow that way. And you know, I am not an artist myself, but I am looking at my desk and noticing that the shadows are all falling in the same direction away from the light. So I don't think he could have done it. He was also somebody who was the only written, there are two written documents that survive from him. One is a letter that he addressed to his teaching colleague and his mentor that is like so soupy and like the sucking up, right? And the other one is his CV, in which he records like on the exact day and the number of hours that he had worked in this particular role in the French public school system. I mean, this was a man with the soul of a bureaucrat, right? And I just find it hard to imagine that a man who is, that man is also a forger. And if he's going to forge it, then why wouldn't he sell it when he was alive, you know? Because I mean, he's been dead for 16 years by the time the painting shows up. So I think it's strange.
Yeah, that's really interesting. We've got a question from one of our fabulous program alums. What additional resources would you like to find to flesh out the research further?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, I would like to open a trunk and find like the complete papers of Louis Roy and all of his family. And then I would also like to find Léon Marseille's diary from 1923, where he says, and then one day this mysterious man came in wearing a cloak and brought me this painting by Gauguin. I'd like to find that. I don't know how many wishes do I get. I
Right?
could go on, right? Yeah.
That's good. So what was the attitude of the French or the Musée d'Orsay to the painting? Were they interested? Was it blasé? Were they curious?
No, they were super curious.
Yeah,
They were super, super curious. Everybody that I talked to, it's really interesting. In the States, there's people are much more and Tori, I don't know what your experience has been. In the States, people look on the European museum people as being in Europe, in Paris and in Brittany, where I worked on this, I would, spin out my story and they would be like, oh yeah, I mean, that happens. Yeah. Just wait a few years, something will change. I mean, they're very like much less preoccupied by the process than we are, I think. And people were very curious. People were very curious about it.
That's interesting. Yeah. Tori, I've got a question for you here. In March 2024, a New York State Supreme Court judge ruled that Sotheby's must reveal the names and contact info of their buyers and sellers. The ruling set a precedent that auctions will be required to disclose this with claimed looted art. Will this have broad implications to aid Provenance researchers, and will it stick?
I don't know if it will stick. I can say that one of the great frustrations as a provenance researcher is dealing with the anonymity of the art market. And I know that the auction houses have their own confidentiality clauses or agreements with customers that they have to respect, but it's very, very frustrating. And depending on the auction house, you may get information after a certain period of time, you may not. So all I can say is the more information that's out there, the easier our jobs are. And at the museum, we also keep information confidential. Sometimes people want to donate things anonymously, and we are bound to uphold that. We can also keep information confidential if that is necessary or if that is a request of the seller, but we still have to be able to do our due diligence. We can't just operate on blind faith and like the good word of the art market. So I hope that it does stick, and I can only hope for more transparency in the market.
Great, thank you. So I think we probably have time for one more question, right? So I think this is a great one to end on. So in the end, who decides? Is it a Gauguin or not? Who makes that? Who is the person that makes that decision?
The Wildenstein-Plattner Institute is who makes that decision. And this summer, the new catalog came out, and it is not in it, and that means that it is not a Gauguin. And I think maybe that expression is a good way to end it too.
Or like the French said, right? Maybe in another 10 years, who knows?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I'm being a little bit silly here, but I mean, I think that what we take away from that is that knowledge is something that changes. I mean, we could find the thing that's like, oh, this is, oh, look, here's Louis Roy's, here are all of the fakes that he made. Here's a list of all the fakes that, I mean, there is always something more out there that people find. And I'm sure, Tori, you find this all the time, that you go back and think, oh, wait, that wasn't available 10 years ago.
Absolutely. Things are becoming increasingly accessible. The digitization of things. I mean, I've been doing this work now long enough that like I was throwing out the other day, faxes from like 20 years ago, from things that had been printed out from microfilm, and these things are now online now. So that just speaks to how much easier the work is becoming, and also like how much more information can become available.
Right. Right. And I just saw a quick question in the chat about the Haggin, and I want to say that the Haggin has been just fabulous. Those folks are my partners, and I would not have been able to do this without their being so game. There's going to be an exhibition. It's opening October 5th. This is your chance to come to Stockton. I can tell you where to eat lunch.
And it looked like from the poll, a lot of people needed to put that
That's
on
right.
their
That's right.
itinerary.
That's right.
So,
Right.
yep, fantastic. Well, thank you, Stephanie.
Well, thank
and
you,
thank you, Victoria.
everybody.
This
Thank
has
you,
been an
Tori.
absolutely wonderful way to spend a Wednesday.
Thank you.